In 1924, life in the small West African village of Adumakram was peaceful but quiet. People woke up to the sound of birds, children ran across dusty paths, and women cooked meals over open fires. No one in the village had ever traveled beyond the nearby towns. They lived simply, helped each other, and believed in unity more than anything else. That is why the villagers were shocked when a strange messenger appeared one morning, sweating heavily under the rising sun. He came on horseback, carrying a thick envelope sealed with deep red wax marked with a symbol no one recognized. The villagers gathered around him as he slowly climbed down from his horse. He announced that he had come from the coastal city, traveling for 3 days to deliver a letter of great importance. Everyone stared with curiosity. It had been years since anyone in Adumakram received a letter, and none had ever arrived in such an official way. The messenger handed the envelope to the village chief, an elderly man with wise eyes named Afori. With trembling hands, Afori opened it while everyone held their breath. He unfolded the paper and read aloud. The words stunned the entire village. The letter was an invitation from a powerful European council. They were organizing a major peace conference meant to shape the future of many nations. Strangely, they requested that 4 representatives from Adumakram attend as special ambassadors. The villagers looked at one another in confusion. Why their small village? Why them? What did Europe want from a place that had nothing but farms, families, and traditional stories? Some thought it must be a mistake. Others whispered that perhaps the world finally wanted to learn about their ancient wisdom. But no one knew the real reason. As the day went on, people gathered under the large baobab tree to discuss what to do. Some were afraid. They had heard stories about foreigners taking advantage of small communities. Some feared the ambassadors might never return, but Chief Ofori silenced the doubts. He believed that this invitation, whether a mistake or not, could be a chance to show the world the strength of their values. The next question was, who would go? Many expected the chief to choose warriors, wealthy traders, or educated men from nearby towns. But Ofori surprised everyone. He believed that true ambassadors should represent the heart of the village, not its status. So he selected 4 men known for their kindness, sincerity, and simple wisdom. The first was Kojo, a quiet farmer with strong arms and a gentle voice. He was the kind of man who woke before sunrise to help elderly neighbors harvest their crops. Kojo never complained, never boasted, and always believed that patience could solve even the hardest problem. The second was Baba, the village schoolteacher. He taught children not just to read and write, but also to think kindly and honestly. He had a calm presence that made even angry parents soften. Baba believed knowledge should make people humble, not proud. The third was Mensa, the village healer. He carried herbs in a small leather pouch and spent hours traveling from house to house, treating the sick without ever asking for payment. He believed healing was a gift from the ancestors, something meant to be shared freely. And the fourth was Kweku, the youngest of the group, only 22. He was a skilled craftsman who carved beautiful tools and decorations from wood. What set him apart was his imagination. He always looked at ordinary things and asked how they could be made stronger, smoother, or more useful. When the chief announced his choices, many were surprised. These men were not politicians, not warriors, and certainly not wealthy. But the chief said something that stayed in everyone's mind. We do not need representatives of power. We need representatives of goodness. The next days were filled with preparation. The 4 ambassadors had never left their homeland. They had never seen the ocean up close. They had never spoken with Europeans. So the villagers taught them everything they could: traditional stories, wise sayings, dances, and blessings meant to bring protection. They stitched new clothes for them, so they would carry a piece of Adumakram wherever they went. The night before their departure, the entire village gathered around a giant fire. Drums echoed through the night, and elders offered prayers for courage and safe travel. Children sat wide-eyed, imagining faraway lands filled with tall buildings and strange machines. Mothers hugged their sons tightly. Fathers placed their hands on the shoulders of the ambassadors, passing quiet strength into their bones. Kojo, Baba, Mensa, and Kweku hardly slept. Their hearts were full of fear, excitement, and the heavy responsibility of representing their people. None of them knew what awaited them, but they understood one thing: they were not traveling for themselves. They were traveling for their entire village, for their ancestors, and for anyone who believed that kindness could cross even the widest oceans. The next morning, the sun rose with a soft golden light. The ambassadors walked to the edge of the village, where the same messenger waited with his horse and a cart that would carry them to the coast. As they stepped onto the cart, people waved, cried, and shouted blessings. The sound chased them down the dusty road until it faded behind distant hills. At the coast, the ambassadors saw something that left them speechless. A gigantic ship made of steel, taller than any tree in their village, with smoke curling from its chimney. They stood frozen, overwhelmed by its size and power. But they gathered their courage and climbed the gangway, each step echoing with fear and hope. As the ship pulled away, Kojo looked back at the coastline slowly disappearing. He wondered if they would return. Baba touched his chest, feeling the thump of his heartbeat. Mensa whispered a prayer, and Kweku stared at the endless horizon, imagining the unknown world ahead. What none of them realized was that their journey, which began with a mysterious letter and a simple act of trust, would soon shake Europe in a way no one could have predicted. When the ambassadors finally set foot in Europe, everything around them felt like another world. The air was colder, the buildings taller, and the streets filled with unfamiliar noises. Cars honked, people rushed past, and giant lamps glowed even during the day. Kojo, Baba, Mensa, and Kweku looked around with wide eyes, trying to absorb everything at once. They had imagined Europe before arriving, but reality was far more overwhelming than any picture formed in their minds. As soon as they stepped out of the ship's passageway, a crowd had already formed. Reporters pushed forward with notepads. Photographers lifted their cameras, their flashes bursting like lightning. The ambassadors flinched at every flash, confused by the loud clicking. A tall journalist shouted, "Look here, over here, who are you representing?" Another yelled, "Do you even understand politics?" The ambassadors exchanged nervous glances. They had never spoken to a reporter in their lives. The newspapers the next morning were filled with headlines that spread across the continent. Some papers used harsh words, questioning how 4 men from a tiny village, unknown, untrained, and unfamiliar with international affairs, could attend such an important conference. Other papers expressed curiosity, describing the ambassadors as unexpected guests whose purpose remains unclear. Some people in Europe laughed at the idea of ordinary men taking part in a major diplomatic event. They imagined them as simple villagers who would sit quietly, lost and confused. But the ambassadors did not react with anger or fear. Instead, they observed everything with calm curiosity. They watched how the cities moved, how people interacted, how trains glided across tracks with metal wheels. Everywhere they went, people stared at them. Some looked with prejudice, some with wonder, and some with genuine interest. But the ambassadors never allowed these reactions to change their approach. They greeted each person politely, even when the other person didn't return the gesture. It was their first night at the Grand Hotel when something unusual happened. While most guests walked past them without a second glance, an elderly woman approached Baba and asked softly, "Are you really ambassadors?" Baba smiled gently and replied, "We are here to listen and learn." The woman nodded with a thoughtful expression, as if she had not expected such a simple, honest answer. Moments like these began to spread a strange whisper through Europe, whispers that these men were different from what the newspapers had claimed. The peace conference began 2 days later in a massive hall, filled with chandeliers, marble floors, and long tables arranged in a circle. Delegates from powerful nations sat confidently in their seats, wearing polished suits and carrying thick documents. When the 4 African ambassadors walked in, every conversation stopped for a moment. Dozens of eyes turned toward them, studying their clothes, their expressions, and their quiet confidence. Kojo felt his heart pounding, but he kept his posture steady. Baba whispered a reminder, "We carry our people with us." During the sessions, other delegates argued fiercely about land, trade, and political influence. They raised their voices, pounded on tables, and interrupted one another. The ambassadors remained quiet, listening to every argument with full attention. Occasionally, Kweku scribbled notes, though he wasn't sure what half the technical terms meant. Mensa observed the tension in the room and recognized something familiar, anger that had not yet found a peaceful path. Their silence did not go unnoticed. Some delegates mocked them behind their backs, saying, "Why are they even here?" Others frowned, confused by their calmness. But gradually, whispers began spreading. "They are not like the others. They seem patient, too patient. What are they waiting for?" The ambassadors did not know that their silence was beginning to intrigue the entire room. One afternoon, when they were walking through the city streets, a young boy suddenly collided with Kojo while running. The boy dropped a loaf of bread, which rolled onto the pavement. The boy looked terrified, expecting anger. But Kojo bent down, picked up the bread, brushed off the dirt, and handed it back with a smile. The boy's mother watched this interaction, stunned. Later, she told the story to neighbors, who then told others. Small moments like this began weaving a new image of the ambassadors, an image of peaceful men who treated everyone, even strangers, with kindness. In the evenings, the ambassadors gathered in their shared hotel room to reflect on the day. Kojo often mentioned how much noise filled the city. Babar reflected on how people spoke quickly but listened little. Mensa was fascinated by the machines and inventions, but he also sensed the emotional wounds hidden behind modern life. Kweku loved studying the structures of buildings, imagining how he might turn such designs into something more natural and connected to the earth. As days passed, more people approached the ambassadors privately, curious, confused, or impressed by their behavior. Some delegates who had initially mocked them now tried to start conversations. They wanted to understand why these men seemed unaffected by pressure, insults, or political tensions. The ambassadors explained in simple sentences, "We believe in listening before speaking. We believe anger blocks solutions. We believe kindness opens doors." These words were strange to the diplomats, who had spent years using tactics, strategies, and forceful negotiation. They found themselves thinking about the ambassadors long after the day's meetings were over. By the end of the second week, Europe was no longer laughing. People were watching. The whispers grew louder. There is something different about these men. They stay calm in every situation. What are they planning? The curiosity was turning into respect, and soon that respect would turn into something much bigger, something that would shake the entire continent when the ambassadors finally spoke. The great debate was scheduled for a cold evening when the sky outside the conference hall was the color of steel, and the wind seemed to carry warnings. Everyone knew that this meeting would determine the direction of the entire conference. Tensions had been rising for weeks, and the disagreements between nations were reaching their peak. Delegates paced the hallways long before the session started, speaking in hurried whispers and carrying stacks of documents like shields. Kojo, Baba, Mensa, and Kweku sat quietly in their seats, feeling the pressure building in the room. They were not political experts, but they could sense the anger in the air as clearly as they sensed a coming storm. Mensa placed his hand on the table and closed his eyes for a moment, as if searching for calm in the middle of chaos. Kojo watched the delegates argue, even before the debate officially began, wondering how people with so much influence could be so lost in their emotions. When the meeting started, the hall erupted with noise. A delegate from one nation stood and shouted accusations at another. The accused responded with equal fury. Documents were slammed onto the table. Translators struggled to keep up with the rapid shouting. No one was interested in listening anymore. It felt as if the conference, which was meant to bring peace, was tearing itself apart. Baba leaned toward the others and whispered, "They are fighting like children." Kweku nodded, though his hands trembled. They were witnessing a level of hostility they had never seen in their village. Mensa looked at the faces around the room and saw anger masking fear. People were not just fighting for pride. They were fighting out of deep worry, unclear even to themselves. Hours passed, The arguments became harsher. Some delegates walked out, then returned only to continue the shouting. The chairman tried to restore order several times, but his voice was drowned by the chaos. At one point, a delegate broke into tears out of sheer frustration. Another threatened to withdraw his country from the agreement entirely. The atmosphere was breaking apart piece by piece. That was when Kojo slowly rose to his feet. At first, no one noticed him. He was just one quiet man in a room full of powerful figures. But when he cleared his throat gently, the sound carried in an unexpected way. A few people turned, then a few more. Slowly, one by one, conversations faded until the hall fell into silence. Kojo didn't hold any documents. He didn't have numbers or political facts to present. All he carried was a memory from his home. In a steady voice that was neither loud nor soft, he began to speak. "In my village," he said, "there were two brothers who fought every day. They argued over land, over animals, over almost anything. Their anger grew so strong that people began to avoid them. One year a terrible drought came, the rivers dried and the crops died. The brothers were forced to share the little water they had. Only then did they learn something. When they fought, they both suffered. But when they shared, they both survived." His words were simple, but something about them echoed through the room like a quiet truth people had forgotten. Delegates who had been shouting minutes earlier now stared at him with uneasy curiosity. Kojo sat down and Baba rose next. "In our village," Baba continued, "everyone can speak, but everyone must also listen. If a person speaks twice before another speaks once, the elders stop the meeting. They say no solution can rise from only one voice. Harmony comes from balance, not dominance." Baba's voice carried warmth, but also firmness, the kind that soothed people even when he said something difficult. Delegates shifted in their seats, absorbing the meaning behind his words. Some looked down, realizing how little listening had taken place during the conference. Then it was Mensa's turn. He stood slowly, his hands folded gently in front of him. "I am a healer," he said quietly. "In my work, I learned that people come to me with wounds they do not understand. They think the problem is the pain, but the real problem is the cause of the pain. If I only treat the wound and not the cause, the illness returns. Nations are no different. Your disagreements are like wounds. Anger is not the cause. It is the symptom. You must look deeper if you want to heal." A hush fell over the hall. Even the most stubborn delegates leaned forward as if trying to catch every word. Finally, young Kweku stood, the smallest and least experienced of the four. His voice trembled at first, but he steadied himself. "I make tools from many pieces," he said. "A handle from one wood, a blade from another, glue made from tree sap. None of them can do anything alone, but together they become something strong. Maybe countries are like that too, different, separate, but capable of creating something better when joined." For the first time since the conference began, there was complete silence. Not an ordinary silence. This one was heavy, meaningful, full of reflection. People were not just listening, they were thinking deeply, confronting their own behavior. The chairman stood slowly, his eyes softened with emotion. "Perhaps," he said, "we have forgotten the simplest truths." Delegates began to exchange glances. Some sighed, others nodded. The tension that had filled the room like dark smoke was slowly lifting, replaced by something gentler, something like humility. A few delegates approached the ambassadors afterward, offering thanks. Others apologized for their earlier cynicism. Many simply shook their hands with quiet respect. The four men had not given political speeches, they had not proposed strategies, they had simply spoken from the heart, and somehow that was exactly what Europe needed at that moment. That night, as the ambassadors walked back to their hotel through the cold evening air, they felt a strange peace settle over them. They had not planned to speak. They had not rehearsed. Yet something greater had guided their words. And unknown to them, their simple stories had just changed the direction of the entire conference. The final day of the conference arrived with an air of anticipation so thick that even the marble walls of the grand hall seemed to hold their breath. Delegates, dressed in their finest suits, Reporters gathered outside in growing numbers, and citizens from across Europe crowded the streets, waiting to hear what the council would decide. After weeks of chaos, arguments, and unexpected calm brought by four humble men, the continent felt as if it were standing on the edge of a turning point. Kojo, Baba, Mensa, and Kweku sat quietly in the back of the hall. They carried no notes, no prepared speeches, and no expectations. Their goal had never been glory. They had simply hoped to bring a little peace where there had been too much anger. Yet as they looked around the hall filled with chandeliers and polished wood, even they could feel something unusual in the air, like the world was waiting for a secret to be revealed. The council members, seated at the highest table, exchanged serious glances. The room fell silent as the chairman rose to speak. He cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, the weight of his responsibility visible in the lines on his forehead. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have reached the end of this historic conference, but before we announce the final agreements, there is something we must address." A ripple of curiosity spread across the hall. Delegates leaned forward. Reporters readied their pens. Every eye turned toward the chairman. He continued, "Over the past weeks, 4 unexpected ambassadors have brought perspective, calm, and wisdom into this room. They have offered guidance without demanding attention, and they have shown us the strength of humility." The chairman gestured toward the 4 men sitting at the back. A spotlight swung toward them. People turned and stared, not with mockery this time, but with respect. Kojo felt his throat tighten. Mensa lowered his gaze. Baba offered a small smile, while Kweku shifted nervously, unused to being the center of a room filled with hundreds. The chairman took a deep breath, preparing for what came next. What he was about to say would shock the entire continent. "These men," he said slowly, "were never meant to be here." A stunned silence crashed across the hall. For a full moment, no one moved. The ambassadors exchanged confused glances. The delegates looked around with disbelief. Murmurs spread like waves. "What does he mean? How is that possible? Is this some kind of mistake?" The chairman raised his hand to quiet the whispers. The invitation sent to their village, he explained, was addressed incorrectly. It was meant to reach a completely different region. Due to an administrative error, the letter was delivered to Adimakram instead. They were never on the list of expected representatives. Gasps echoed from every corner of the hall. Reporters dropped their pens. Delegates widened their eyes. A few even stood up in shock. The ambassadors sat frozen, unable to fully understand what this revelation meant. All this time, they had believed that the world genuinely wanted to hear from their small village. The chairman continued, "And yet, this mistake has become one of the most important events of this conference." The tension softened, but the shock remained. In our desperation to find solutions, we forgot something essential. The chairman said, "These men reminded us of truths we had abandoned. They spoke not with strategy, but with sincerity. They came not with power, but with wisdom born of everyday life." A council member rose from his seat and added, "Their presence changed the tone of our meetings. Their stories guided us when our emotions clouded our judgment. In many ways, they saved this conference." The room burst into applause. It began slowly, then grew louder, rolling through the hall like thunder. People clapped not out of politeness, but out of genuine gratitude. Kojo felt tears sting his eyes. Baba placed a hand on his shoulder. Mensa quietly wiped a tear from his cheek. Kweku looked overwhelmed, unable to believe that their small voices had reached so far. The chairman raised his hand again as the applause faded. What began as a mistake, he said, revealed something extraordinary. Sometimes the world does not need the strongest voice. Sometimes it needs the quietest truth. Sometimes leaders must learn from those they never expected to teach them. He paused, letting his words settle in the hearts of everyone present. "And so," he continued, "we declare these 4 men honorary ambassadors of peace." The hall erupted once more. Reporters rushed forward, snapping photographs. Some delegates stood and bowed their heads out of respect. Others walked toward the ambassadors with outstretched hands, but the 4 men did not celebrate. They felt humbled, almost shy under all the attention. They had not come to Europe seeking fame. They had simply followed the invitation because their village entrusted them with the duty. That evening, they packed their bags in quiet reflection. Tomorrow, they would return home, but something deep inside each of them had changed. They now knew that even ordinary voices can influence the world when spoken with honesty. They also felt a growing responsibility, not just to represent their village, but to carry the message of unity wherever they went. The next morning, at the harbor, crowds gathered to see them off. People waved, some shouted thanks, and many held signs praising their wisdom. The ambassadors boarded the ship feeling both proud and emotional. As the vessel pulled away, they looked back at the European shore slowly fading behind them. Kojo whispered, "Who would have thought a mistake would bring us here?" Baba smiled and replied, "Perhaps it was not a mistake." Menser rested his hand on the railing and said, "Sometimes destiny hides inside accidents." Kweku stared at the horizon and murmured, "The world is bigger than we imagined, but kindness reaches all of it." They watched the waves carry them toward home, toward their village, their people, and the lives they had left behind. They did not return as heroes seeking praise, but as humble men who had learned that even in grand halls filled with powerful leaders, a simple truth spoken with heart can shake the world. And in Europe, long after they left, their stories continued to be told, whispers of the black ambassadors who arrived by mistake, yet changed everything.